Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 3 Biopsychology and the Foundations of Neuroscience, Part 6. And in Part 6, we're going to get into talking a little bit about the cooperative brain. So, one thing that we should kind of take away is that there's no one specific area of the brain that for the most part is like the brain center for like any major activity. Like back in the day of Franz Joseph Gall and other phrenologists, they believed that there was like an exact part of the brain that would do certain activities like learning and memory and such. And what we have found is that actually there are many different parts of the brain that are involved in things like attention, consciousness, learning, memory, thinking, language, and emotion, or even motivation. And when we coordinate all these areas, we have to use something called an association cortex. These are regions throughout the brain that combine information from various parts of the brain to help us basically interpret sensations, lay out plans, make decisions, prepare for action. And this is something that we as humans are really, really good at in comparison to other animals and other mammals, by all means. Okay, so mental processes for the most part involve the coordination and cooperation of many brain networks. And so there are lots of different areas here where we're going to find these association cortex. It's not just the motor and the sensory cortex, but it is a variety of different areas. If you look at the different graphics that I have here on your page. Along with that, we've got to talk a little bit about cerebral dominance, because we find that there's evidence, when we look at the two hemispheres, that they might actually specialize in certain tasks. And I think you're all familiar with things like people being maybe right-brained or left-brained. And if you take a look at these graphics here, left-brained people, for the most part, they have a tendency to be good at writing and speech and mathematics and logic and analytical kind of things. Whereas when we look at the right brain, we're talking about things that are very spatial, musical, geometric, recognition of faces, creativity. So for the most part, there is a tendency for us to kind of rely on one hemisphere maybe more than another. And this combination is basically the terminology for cerebral dominance. It's the tendency for each brain hemisphere to exert control over different functions such as language or perception of spatial relationships. And a fellow named Paul Broca, who we're going to mention here, was a fellow that was known as a neurologist. He was a French neurologist who happened to study patients who had speech impairments that were resulting from brain injuries. And some of his research led to the identification of this area of the brain called the Broca's area. It's part of the brain specifically in the left frontal lobe that's linked to language production and language processing. And he had worked with a patient named Tan. Okay, and Tan happened to be an individual who had had a brain injury, and he had something called aphasia, which basically is the loss of speech due to some kind of brain injury. Anyway, this patient of Broca's, he was named Tan because of the fact that he pretty much could only say the word tan, and hence that's kind of the name that he was given. As a result of this, and the fact that when Tan passed away, Broca was able to analyze his brain and notice that there had been severe damage to the left frontal portion of his brain. And this clue prompted Broca to study other patients who had had aphasia the loss of speech due to brain injury. And again, he found that there was damage, for the most part, on the left frontal lobe. And hence, that's where we have identified this area called the Broca's area. Not to say that there couldn't be other issues, and this is kind of leading to the Wernicke's area. This is a portion of the brain in the left temporal lobe responsible for language comprehension. And so there were some brain damage patients that suffered paralysis on the right side of their bodies that developed speech disturbances, suggesting that the production of speech involves the frontal lobes, usually in the left hemisphere. And when we talk about damage to the left parietal lobe and the left temporal lobe, these are areas that commonly produce problems in the understanding or the comprehension of language. So people with a right-sided brain injury are probably less often going to have speech problems. What they're probably going to have instead are difficulties with spatial relationships. In other words, locating themselves or being able to, for the most part, identify things in a three-dimensional space. Musical ability may also be associated with the right hemisphere, and they may, again, have some issues with that. So, thank you very much.